There's a famous saying that there are three things in the world that must have an effect: wealth, drink, and Chassidus, the study of Chassidus. If a person says, I'm wealthy, it had no effect on me, you're not wealthy enough. And if you say, I drink, it doesn't have any effect on me, you haven't had enough. And the same with Chassidus. If you say, I learned Chassidus and it hasn't affected me, you haven't learned enough. Because it must have an effect. Let's see if we can understand or appreciate why that is. What is this effect that Chassidus has? So I got to tell you, in 1970, my wife and I moved to Minnesota, our shlichus, and in some strange way, it really started as a joke, we opened a program for women. We were sitting around joking about all the men who are becoming observant in the men's yeshivas. Who are they going to marry? We were literally joking about it. We said, maybe we should start something for the women. And that's how it began. We sent out a little flyer inviting women to come to the Chabad house during their summer break to study Judaism. We didn't expect any response, but 18 women showed up. And these were the radical political activists of the 60s who were angry at the world because their project didn't work. Now, they couldn't stop the war in Vietnam. They didn't completely radically change the universities with their... So they were frustrated and they were angry, and they marched into the Chabad house in military boots. They basically walked in and said, what do you know? Because on the flyer, we made the mistake of saying, come learn the purpose of life. They said, you know the purpose of life? They were scary. They were SDS members. Anybody know what that is? Yeah? Mm-hmm. It was like, teach us something or we'll burn this building down. So, without intending to, I became the teacher. That was not the plan. When my grandfather found out that I'm teaching women, he couldn't believe it. That it was so untraditional. Anyway, we thought we would, have classes like beginning at 4 in the afternoon until dinner. It's vacation time. It's summer. They'll do a little sightseeing. They'll go shopping. Got the wrong women here. They don't do sightseeing and they don't do shopping. They wanted answers. Without any exaggeration, classes and discussions went from 9 in the morning till 8 in the morning. I slept on the floor and started all over again. It was crazy but wonderful. So I got to learn all about the political system, the corruption, all the evils that they had been fighting. And by the end of the summer, I was ready for the next session, because I knew all about the military-industrial complex and all their evils. The next summer, 42 women showed up, and they didn't want to hear about politics. Not one of them. It was over, it was done, not interesting. They wanted to know about Buddhism. They had all just come back from India, from Tibet. They were all meditating. They were like gurus. And they wanted to know, what does Judaism have that Buddhism doesn't? So that summer, I got a real education on Buddhism. There was one woman there who was the right-hand man of the Dalai Lama. And he sent her home. She was there for about 5 or 6 years. And he said, it's time for you to go home. And she was very impressed. Like, he's so open-minded. You know? He said, time for you to go back to your tradition. It turned out he sent her away because she was changing Buddhism. She was bringing in Jewish ideas. She was ruining everything. So he said, you got to leave. So I found out all about Buddhism. So we decided maybe we should have a winter session for the winter break from college. These are all college women. So a few months later, in January, we had a winter session, and I'm ready because I know all about Buddhism. Nobody was interested in Buddhism. Nobody. They wanted to know why we're eating so many carbohydrates. They wanted seaweed and macrobiotics. So we had 3 kitchens going because, this one wouldn't need that and this one wouldn't need the other. Every session, the world changed. But what remained steady was that we learned Tanya. And these are women who know nothing. Nothing. We have to tell them what Yom Tov means. But we learned Tanya. And they found it perfectly understandable and relevant. Now, this is something really amazing. Tanya was written for religious people in Russia 200 years ago. How could it possibly be relevant today? How could it be relevant to people who are not religious? How is that possible? But in some way, the Tanya is more relevant today than it was 200 years ago. So Chassidus has some magical quality to it. It transcends time and culture and location. There's one teenage girl who showed up from Israel. We're sitting and studying Tanya, and third day or something, she was there. We sat down to talk. She knew nothing. She grew up on a kibbutz. They had no Judaism there whatsoever. All she knows is that her grandfather, her great-grandfather, was the first rabbi. I said, the first rabbi? You mean like Moses? Who was your... She doesn't know. All she knows is he was the first rabbi. The Alter Rebbe. The first Chabad rabbi was her grandfather. I said, we're reading his book. She was sitting there studying Tanya, had no idea that it was her grandfather. So, what is it about Chassidus? This month, by the way, Kislev, is the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. Because the Alter Rebbe was freed from Tsarist imprisonment and was given a green light by the Tsar to teach his philosophy. They thought it was anti-government or revolutionary, but it turned out that it was a really profound philosophy about life, and they actually encouraged, the Tsar encouraged the study of it. What is it about Chassidus, and what is it about today that Chassidus resonates? So the first thing is, Chassidus is the Torah. Because when we say the Torah, we're not just talking about 5 books of Moses. We're talking about all the written books of Torah and all the oral works of Torah, including Kabbalah, including Hasidus. So these are all dimensions or layers of Torah that were given at Mount Sinai. But it unfolds gradually over history as needed. So when we need a deeper, stronger connection to God because of the suffering and the time lapse since the giving of the Torah, another dimension of Torah becomes available. So there was a time when studying Kabbalah was forbidden. Then all of a sudden it had to be made available. We needed a new injection of inspiration. The most recent, the latest dimension of Torah is Hasidus, teachings of Hasidus. So we're not talking about some individual's philosophy. Just like if you can imagine Hillel, the elder, was sitting and teaching in the academy to a room full of students. Did those students have any idea that whatever Hillel said would be recorded in the Gemara and the Mishnah, studied forever? They had no idea. When the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, they had no idea that this would go on for 200 years and that people in America would study it? In America? Nobody speaks Hebrew in America. So we don't know at the time that it's given. Rambam, for example. 800 years later, we're studying, analyzing every word he wrote and why he used this word and not that word. Did he himself realize what he was doing? That what he was saying and writing would be studied for 800 years? And it hasn't stopped. So it's part of Torah, but it comes out at the right time, the right place, as needed. So in a sense, God makes himself more and more available through Torah. So if you look at the 5 books of the Chumash, there isn't much personal revelation of God's intentions, God's feelings, God's purpose. It's the do's and the don'ts. This is kosher, this is not, this is okay, this is forbidden. When you look a little later in the prophets, God gets a little more personal. He's upset why we're not listening, or he gets a lot of pleasure because everything was going well. Becomes even more personal in Tehillim. Becomes embarrassingly personal in the Song of Songs. It becomes more and more revealing of God himself. The ultimate knowledge of God that we have is in Hasidus. Kabbalah speaks more about activities of heaven, angels, souls, divine attributes, not about God himself. It's almost like the mechanics of heaven, which is fascinating and awesome, but still not as personal as we want to get. So, halachically, the requirement for studying Hasidus is that we have a mitzvah. Rambam says it's the first mitzvah, and that is to know God, to get to know him. How do we do that? In most schools where Hasidus is not studied, the attitude, the assumption is, God is not knowable. Can't know him. To know him is to be him. It's impossible. So the subject, knowledge of God, is pretty neglected. All we know is that we don't know. That's not fulfilling the mitzvah at all. So in Hasidus, we get to fulfill the mitzvah of getting to know God. And why is that so important? Isn't loving God more important than knowing him? How can you love him if you don't know him? Who are you loving? A figment of your imagination? To know him is to love him. No, that's not original, but it's a good quote. Yeah, right. So certainly the mitzvah to love God is a big mitzvah. We say it in the Shema. You should love God with all your heart, with all your soul. But how do you do that? If all you can say about God is that you can't know him, then you can't love him either. So getting to know God, that is the goal. That's the objective. And as we get to know him, we are in effect bringing him down to earth. By saying he's unknowable, we're limiting him to heaven. When we get to know him, we're making him more available, more present in our world. So we're bringing God down to earth. So I want to tell you a story, which is the best way to communicate ideas. It was sometime in the early 70s. I came into New York from Minnesota, and I walked up to the offices next to 770, next to the Rebbe's shul. And my brother and some other guys who worked there were rearranging a room that was a stock room, and they're turning it into an office. So they're schlepping furniture and boxes. So there was one file cabinet that was being wheeled out of the room. The drawer slipped open, and a manila folder fell out. We pick it up. It's got a single letter in it on stationery from a doctor in Manhattan, a Dr. Jacobson. A letter to the Rebbe on his stationery, and the Rebbe's answer in the margins of the stationery. That's how the Rebbe would handle the correspondence, hundreds of letters a day. He would write his answer right on your letter. But he would write it in Hebrew, which is more concentrated than English. And if it needed to be translated into English, the secretary would translate it. So we sat down to read the letter. Dr. Jacobson writes to the Rebbe, "My friend, a wealthy man, wanted to write a Sefer Torah. He hired a scribe, and he had him write a Torah. When the Torah was almost complete, you make a whole ceremony, the introduction of a new Torah. So you leave the last letters blank, you make a big party, and at the party you fill in those last letters. It's a big celebration with a chuppah. You carry the Torah to the shul where it's going to be." So this man, Mr. Shapiro, asked Dr. Jacobson if the party could be held in the doctor's apartment in Manhattan, which was larger than this guy's apartment. So the celebration for the completion of the Torah was in Dr. Jacobson's apartment. One of the guests who was invited was a young woman, single woman, and she suffered an aneurysm and died on the spot. So Dr. Jacobson is writing, asking the Rebbe, how do I explain this? He says, my faith is okay, I'm fine. My belief, I'm fine. But people are asking me, especially students, how does this happen? You come to a party of a Torah and you die? So when somebody says, I'm okay, but my friend wants to know. There was a chassid who came to the Tzemach Tzedek and said, my friend asked me to ask, how do you do tshuva for committing adultery? So the Rebbe said, why didn't your friend come and ask himself? He said, well, embarrassed. So the Rebbe said, why is he embarrassed? He can come here and tell me that he has a friend who wants to know. So the guy admitted that it was him. So Dr. Jacobson says, I'm fine, but my friends want to know. His second question is, why did it happen in my apartment? So he's not so fine. He's a little spooked. The Rebbe's answer was in brief points. We were absolutely floored. Listen, I'll just tell you and you decide yourself. The Rebbe writes like this. First of all, why do human beings think they can understand God? Point number 2. The Torah tells us to try to understand God, so we have to try. Point number 3. Every human being born into this world is given a certain amount of time. The angel announces 40 days before conception how long you're going to live, down to the minute. Right, this comedian says, I know exactly when I'm going to die. My birth certificate has an expiration date. So I know exactly when it's going to be over. The angel announces exactly when you're going to die. Long life, short life, whatever it is, it's programmed. Very, very rarely can a person do something so horrendous that his life is cut short. Very rare. People think, oh, you sinned, you're going to die. No. If the angel announces a certain amount of years, that's what's going to be. You would have to do something so awful to change the divine plan. And very seldom can you do something so magnificent that years are added to your life. You live the lifespan that you're given at birth. When the time comes, it can happen in many different circumstances, some better, some not so better. For example, a person is traveling abroad where nobody knows him and he passes away. Nobody cares, nobody's concerned. That's not so good. You pass away at a ripe old age in your bed, surrounded by your family, much better. In fact, those last moments when the person knows that he's dying, every detail becomes magnified and significant and meaningful. So this girl, who was an personally observant girl, you have no idea, the Rebbe says, how significant it was for her to know that she is dying, her life is ending, in a room that has a mezuzah on the door. And the mezuzah says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Because she couldn't say it. That her life ended together with the conclusion of a Torah is actually a great honor. So what should you tell your friends and the students? That they just saw a beautiful example of divine providence. In fact, the Rebbe says, according to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, why did Mr. Shapiro suddenly decide to write a Torah in the first place? So we're sitting there marveling. What were we thinking? People get outraged. She comes to a party of the conclusion of a Torah and she dies? That's not right. What do you think? She died because she was there? Like this was a punishment for her being there? What were we thinking? It just so happens that there was a chassid from Eretz Yisrael, an older chassid, came to New York for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. On the eve of Yom Kippur, they asked him to open the Ark for Kol Nidre. He was on his way to the Ark in 770, and he had a heart attack and died. On Yom Kippur, in Shul, on his way to the Ark, all the guys his age were so jealous. How did he arrange that? How did he pull that off? Because when you come to heaven, the first thing they ask you is, where are you coming from? What were you doing? I was with the Rebbe in Shul, 770. It was Yom Kippur. I was on my way to the Ark. Not bad. Could be a lot more embarrassing than that. There was another chassid who lived in Brooklyn who died in 770 on Simchas Torah during the dancing. And all the old guys said, that's even better. he danced right into heaven. I don't get the impression that people die in 770. It's like a dangerous place to go. No. So the circumstances of birth, every detail is significant. The circumstances of death, every detail is significant. So instead of thinking, now why would she die at a party? No. If you got to go, you should go like a mensch, under the best of circumstances. Anyway, the Rebbe says, your second question, why did it happen in your apartment? Guess what the Rebbe said? You're a doctor. What happened in your apartment? You're a doctor. Usually you take care of patients in the hospital. Well, this time it happened in your apartment, but it was perfect. You're a doctor. Right? It's not the end of the story. We were sitting there, stunned, marveling at the clarity of vision. It's almost like the Rebbe could tell you what God is thinking. The phone rings. We answer the phone. There's a rabbi who is in a panic. He wants us to take a note to the Rebbe to ask the Rebbe what he should do. He is celebrating the bar mitzvah of his son in the Midwest. And his father, the bar mitzvah boy's grandfather, came in from Israel and had a heart attack during the bar mitzvah and died. And they're in the middle of the bar mitzvah. And he doesn't know what to do. Call it off, tell everybody to go home? What do I do? What do I tell people? He's in a panic. We said, you got a pencil? Take this down. We dictated the answer, word for word. And he went back and he read it to the guests at the party, and they were blown away. Now we're marveling all over again. The letter was at least 10 years old. It happens to fall out that day. The guy calls and needs to hear what is written in that letter. Come on. This is too good. And then we look at each other. According to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, who decided to rearrange this room? Why are we schlepping furniture? Nobody knew. Nobody knew. That room never became an office. It was just for that letter to fall out so that we could read it to this. So when you see divine providence with such clarity, that means you understand God. You can think the way He's thinking. That comes from learning Chassidus. And will that change your life? Absolutely. You see a whole new world. What was dark and foreboding and tragic, and all of a sudden, it's beautiful. It changes everything.